This podcast is brought to you by Arete Media.
Welcome back to the AI Analysis Podcast. Today, we're going to be looking at another episode of the Average Intelligence Podcast. And the episode that they were discussing, or the video, I should say, that they were discussing is titled, Ukraine and Russia. Is this what will spark WW3? Let's hope not.
Ooh, that's a loaded title right there.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to kind of break down their discussion and try to extract for you, the listener, the most important insights and try to help you understand the complexities of this situation.
Yeah, because I think, anyone who's been following this, it can be a very confusing situation with a lot of different moving parts.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember right up front that the hosts of the Average Intelligence Podcast, mentioned that they don't have, direct knowledge of Ukraine.
Right.
And they're, basing their discussion on, various news sources and social media.
That's right. Yeah, they're getting their information from, a variety of places, just like most of us probably are.
Yeah. So let's jump in.
I guess so too.
So right away, they express this kind of nervousness about the potential for this whole thing to escalate.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tense situation, and I think it's natural to be concerned about that possibility.
Right. And, almost right after that, though, they bring up this point about the U.S. news media.
Oh, yeah.
And how, maybe we're not getting the full picture.
Right. And that's something I think we see a lot in situations like this, where the media coverage can be very focused on a particular narrative or perspective.
Yeah, and it can be hard to get, a more balanced or complete understanding of what's really going on.
Exactly. And that's where I think it's really valuable to look at a variety of sources and perspectives.
Right. And that kind of leads into something that one of the hosts mentions.
Yeah.
Which is that he follows a Vladimir Putin TikTok account.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
And they make sure to clarify that it's probably not actually Vladimir Putin.
Right. I mean, I would imagine not, but...
But it's interesting that that's, even in the mix.
Yeah. I mean, it just goes to show how diverse the information landscape is these days.
Yeah.
Where you can have, traditional news sources alongside these more, informal and sometimes unreliable sources.
Yeah. And I think that makes it even more challenging to figure out, what information to trust and what to be skeptical of.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face in the digital age.
So drawing on all these different sources, they kind of arrive at this conclusion that the situation is not quite as cut and dry as it's often portrayed.
Right. And I think that's an important point because there's a tendency to want to simplify complex situations and see things in black and white terms.
Yeah, and they even use the term mental gymnastics to describe Russia's position.
Yeah.
Which kind of suggests they see a certain level of complexity or maybe even contradiction in Russia's justifications.
Mm-hmm. The term mental gymnastics is interesting because it implies that there's a certain amount of effort involved in trying to understand the other side's point of view.
Right. It's not just a simple, good versus bad situation.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of nuance and complexity involved.
And then they kind of shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And start talking about corruption in Ukraine.
Okay.
And they're pretty upfront about their belief that there are high levels of corruption within the Ukrainian government.
Right. And that's something that has been widely reported and acknowledged by various organizations and international observers.
Yeah, they even say that they believe the Ukrainian government has been replaced pretty much twice because of this corruption.
Wow. So they see it as a systemic problem.
Yeah, and they go so far as to even bring up corruption involving the U.S. and Ukraine.
Oh, really?
Specifically mentioning the quid pro quo situation with Biden.
Oh, right.
And the withholding of aid.
Yeah, that was a very controversial issue.
It was. And it kind of highlights how complex the relationships are between all the different parties involved.
Yeah, it's not just a simple bilateral relationship between Russia and Ukraine.
Right. There are all these other actors and interests at play.
Exactly.
And this kind of leads them to a really interesting point about different viewpoints and how the same event can be interpreted in very different ways.
Right. I think that's a really important point to keep in mind when we're talking about any complex situation.
Yeah, they actually quote Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars.
Oh, wow.
To illustrate this.
Interesting.
So they're talking about whether or not Russia has actually invaded Ukraine.
Okay.
And they bring up the Obi-Wan Kenobi, quote, depends greatly on your own point of view.
Yeah, that That actually makes a lot of sense in this context.
Yeah, and it really highlights how the language we use to describe this situation can be very loaded.
Right. The words we choose can reflect our own biases and perspectives.
Exactly. So then they delve into Russia's official stance on the situation, which is that they have recognized the defecting regions of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states.
Right. And that was a very significant move that really escalated the situation.
It did. And they also point out that Russian troops are already present in these regions,
Yeah.
although Russia describes them as peacekeeping forces.
Right. But the use of that term peacekeeping is very controversial.
It is. And the hosts of the Average Intelligence podcast kind of put air quotes around it.
Yeah, I can see why they would do that.
Because they're signaling that they're skeptical of that description.
Right. I mean, depending on your perspective, those troops could be seen as anything but peacekeepers.
Yeah, exactly. Then they kind of go off on a tangent.
Okay.
And they start talking about the movie The Invention of Lying.
Really?
Yeah, and the concept of necessary lies.
Huh. That's an interesting connection to make.
It is, but it doesn't really seem to have much to do with the main discussion about Ukraine.
Right. It's kind of a random tangent.
It is. So let's bring it back to Ukraine.
Okay.
So they're trying to answer the question of why now? Like, why is Russia taking these actions now?
Oh, that's a big question.
It is. And their main theory is that it's driven by opportunity.
Opportunity.
Yeah. They see it as a window of opportunity.
Okay.
Specifically with the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk.
Yeah. Right. So they're saying that Russia is taking advantage of the situation to further its own interests.
Exactly. And they also point out that the conflict in the region has been going on and off since 2014.
Right. Yeah. This is not something that just suddenly happened out of nowhere.
No, it has a long and complicated history. And a big part of that history is the fact that regions like Donetsk and Luhansk have significant populations of ethnic Russians.
Right. And that's something that Russia has used to justify its actions.
Yeah, they're claiming to be protecting the rights of these Russian-speaking populations. And they draw a parallel here to the annexation of Crimea in 2014,
Right.
which was also done through a referendum.
Right. But the legitimacy of that referendum was widely disputed.
It was. And that kind of highlights the different interpretations of events that we're seeing from the West versus Russia.
Yeah. It's really two completely different narratives.
It is. And then they get into a bit of political speculation
Okay.
about how things might have been different if Trump were still president.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. They speculate that Russia might not be acting as aggressively if Trump were still in office.
Interesting.
And their reasoning is that Trump is so unpredictable.
Right. He's kind of a wild card.
Yeah. And they think that that might have actually deterred Putin.
Huh. I guess that's possible.
Or that Trump would have been more likely to negotiate with Putin.
Yeah. I mean, Trump did seem to have a somewhat cordial relationship with Putin,
He did.
at least at times.
Right. But that's all just speculation, of course.
Right. We can't know for sure what would have happened.
No. So then they move on to another really important topic, which is NATO
Okay.
and the concept of buffer zones.
Right. Because that's been a major source of tension between Russia and the West.
It has, yeah. So they present the argument that Russia is very concerned about the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO.
Right. Because that would essentially extend NATO's border right up to Russia's doorstep.
Yeah. And they see that as a huge threat.
Yeah, I can understand why they would feel that way.
And they also talk about the EU and how Russia is also concerned about Ukraine joining the EU.
Right, because that would also strengthen Ukraine's ties to the West.
Yeah, and move it further away from Russia's sphere of influence.
Exactly.
But they also acknowledge the counter-argument, which is that Ukraine is a sovereign nation
Right.
and has the right to choose its own alliances.
Absolutely.
So it's not really up to Russia to dictate what Ukraine does.
Yeah, that's a key point.
It is. And then they briefly mention the strategic importance of Crimea.
Oh, right, because of its access to the Black Sea.
Yeah, and that's why it's been such a flashpoint in this conflict.
Makes sense.
Okay, so here's where their conversation takes a really interesting turn.
Okay.
They start talking about Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland.
Wow, going way back in history.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting historical parallel to what's happening now with Ukraine.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So they lay out the key events leading up to World War II.
Okay.
So first you have the demilitarization of the Rhineland, and then Hitler comes along and remilitarizes it.
Yeah, that was a major violation of the Treaty of Versailles.
It was. And then you have the Sudetenland.
Which had a large ethnic German population.
Exactly. And Hitler demands that the Sudetenland be given to Germany.
Right.
And the international community at the time led by Neville Chamberlain.
Yeah. Chamberlain the Great Appeaser.
Yeah, they agree to give the Sudetenland to Hitler in an effort to avoid war.
Oh, wow. So they just gave in to his demands.
Yeah, and they did it without even consulting Czechoslovakia.
Wow, that's pretty messed up.
It is, yeah. And of course, as we know, that didn't stop Hitler.
No.
He went on to annex the rest of Czechoslovakia.
Right, and then he invaded Poland, which officially started World War II.
Yeah. So the hosts of the Average Intelligence podcast are drawing a parallel here to what's happening now with Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, I can see the parallel.
They're suggesting that Russia might try to take more territory beyond just Donetsk and Luhansk.
Just like Hitler did with Czechoslovakia.
Exactly.
It's a scary thought.
It is, yeah. And it really highlights the potential dangers of appeasement.
Right, because giving in to an aggressor's demands might just embolden them to take even more.
Yeah, it's a really important lesson from history. Okay, we're going to take a quick break now.
Okay.
Forward from our sponsors.
Sponsor break.
Okay, so have you ever had that, nagging feeling, you know? That you have this amazing podcast idea just waiting to break out.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Then you start thinking about all the stuff that goes into it, and it's like, whoa, hold on, maybe not today.
It can be daunting, for sure. All the tech, the recording, editing, getting it out there for people to actually hear.
Right. Like, where do you even begin? We've been digging into Arete Media.
And it's really interesting how they've set things up.
Yeah, it seems like they've got this whole...
To help people take that leap.
From idea to a real live podcast.
Exactly. And maybe even faster than you'd think.
So just starting with the name Arete.
Pronounced arete, by the way.
Right, arete. It's Greek.
Yeah. It's all about this idea of excellence.
Like reaching your full potential.
Which, when you think about it, that's kind of what a podcast is.
It is. You're putting your ideas out there.
Realizing that potential.
And Arete Media seems like they're all about helping you do that.
And it's not like some massive corporation either.
Yeah, they call themselves a confederation of content creators.
Which sounds way more human, right?
It does. And that whole idea of freedom of expression.
Having the power to get your ideas out there on your own terms.
Which is huge.
And if you've ever felt that frustration...
Of wanting to create but feeling limited...
Arete gets it.
They understand that drive.
Their mission is so simple but powerful.
It's all about helping content creators.
Whether it's producing, distributing, or just generally helping with the whole process.
So if you're listening and thinking, okay, I have the idea...
But what about the recording, the editing?
Getting it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all that.
Arete is addressing those exact concerns.
It's like they're saying, come on, we got you.
It's like this supportive, creative ecosystem.
And when you look at the range of podcast topics they cover...
It's mind-blowing.
Sports with down the middle.
Niche stuff like Part of Your Broadway World podcast.
Even spooky stuff with the Goosebumps crew.
And cutting-edge tech with the Arete AI Analysis Podcast.
So they're open to all kinds of ideas.
Whatever your concept is.
They probably have experience in that area.
Or they know someone who does.
And that's where it gets really practical for you listening.
This team brings real-world skills to the table.
Editing, graphic arts, music production.
Even insights into talent management.
The business side of things.
These are the tools and knowledge that can turn your idea
into a polished professional podcast.
So that idea of a confederation?
It starts to make a lot of sense.
It's not just a company. It's a group of talented individuals.
Who can collaborate and support you.
Offering guidance and practical help.
Exactly. It's like having access to a team of specialists.
Without having to hire them all yourself.
And they say they're willing to help in any way possible.
Which suggests they're flexible.
They want to understand your needs and tailor their support.
Maybe you've recorded episodes but need help with editing.
Or you need guidance on getting listed on platforms.
So if you've been putting off that podcast idea,
feeling overwhelmed by all the steps involved,
Arete Media might be the solution.
They offer a supportive community.
A ton of expertise.
To help you go from idea to launch.
They've built the infrastructure, they've got the talent.
And it sounds like they're ready to help you tap into that.
It all boils down to that promise of turning your idea into reality.
They're driven by a passion for creating and sharing content. What amazing stories are out there waiting to be told?
What unique insights are you holding back?
That could find their perfect home in a podcast.
Exactly, with Arete Media's support.
Maybe the missing piece is you. All right, welcome back. So after that deep dive into history, the conversation kind of shifts gears again.
Okay.
And they start talking about some other stuff.
Like what?
Well, they have a little tangent on Omicron immunity.
Oh, right, the COVID variant.
Yeah, and they're talking about a news report that claimed 73% of the U.S. population has immunity to Omicron.
Okay.
But they're also expressing some skepticism about mainstream media figures.
Right.
And they share some of their own personal experiences with COVID testing and mask mandates.
Yeah. I mean, it's understandable that people would be talking about COVID still.
Yeah, it's been a major part of our lives for the past few years. Then they touch on the Canadian trucker convoy.
Oh, right. The protests against the vaccine mandates.
Yeah, and they kind of connect it to supply chain issues,
Okay.
especially in California.
Oh, right. With the truck regulations there.
Yeah, they're suggesting that these kinds of protests and regulations could exacerbate supply chain problems.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Then they have a whole conversation about vaccine mandates for truckers crossing the border between the U.S. and Canada.
Okay.
And they talk about religious exemptions,
Right.
and they express a lot of frustration with these policies.
Yeah, that was a very divisive issue.
It was. And then they go off on another interesting tangent about Switzerland.
Switzerland.
Yeah, they're talking about Switzerland's mandatory military service for men.
Oh, right. I think I've heard about that.
Yeah, and how they're issued assault rifles or pistols to keep at home.
Wow.
And they're suggesting that this system is why Switzerland wasn't invaded during World War II.
Interesting. I mean, it's definitely a unique system.
It is. And that kind of leads them into a discussion about why the United States would be difficult to invade. And they cite a number of reasons for this.
Like what?
Well, they talk about the widespread gun ownership in the U.S.
Right.
And they kind of paint this picture of Texans being especially fierce in their resistance.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. And they talk about the terrain of the U.S.
Okay.
and how it would be challenging for an invading force to navigate.
Like the Rocky Mountains?
Yeah. And they even make some humorous comments about how New York has all these gang populations and Florida's just crazy.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, it's a pretty colorful assessment of the U.S.
It is, yeah.
But I think their main point is that the U.S. is a very large and diverse country.
Right.
With a lot of potential for resistance. And then they throw in a little hypothetical scenario about what Trump might say about Biden's handling of the Ukraine situation.
Oh.
And they kind of play up Trump's, big balls persona.
Yeah, Trump was definitely known for his colorful language.
He was. But let's get back to the core issues here with Ukraine and Russia.
Right.
So they reiterate the points about the natural gas issues and the alleged debt that Ukraine owes to Russia and Russia's desire for a buffer zone between itself and NATO and the EU. And then they have this really interesting discussion about how to refer to Ukraine.
Oh, okay.
So historically, it was often called the Ukraine.
Right.
But the current Ukrainian government prefers just Ukraine. And they explain that Ukraine literally means borderland.
Huh. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and they talk about how Ukraine has historically been this kind of border region between Russia and Europe, and how it was part of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. But now Ukraine is an independent country, and they want to be called Ukraine.
Yeah, to emphasize their sovereignty.
Exactly. And they also have a brief discussion about cryptocurrency.
Oh, yeah.
And how the value of crypto has been going down because of the situation with Ukraine.
Right.
And they have different opinions on how Bitcoin specifically might perform during a conflict.
Yeah, it's hard to say how these digital assets will be affected by real-world events.
Then they get into a really long comparison between Hunter Biden and Dick Cheney.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, so they're talking about Hunter Biden's work for a Ukrainian natural gas company called Burisma, while his father was vice president.
Okay.
And they compare that to Dick Cheney's involvement with Halliburton.
Oh, right.
And its contracts in Iraq.
Yeah.
So they're basically drawing parallels between these two situations.
Okay.
And talking about the perceived conflicts of interest. And the allegations of corruption in both cases.
Yeah, that's a pretty loaded comparison.
It is. And finally, they end their discussion on a very important note.
Okay.
They talk about the correct way to hang a toilet paper roll.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
That's a classic debate.
It is. And they're very firm in their belief
Which way?
that it should hang over.
Over, not under.
Over. And they even cite the original patent to support their argument.
Wow, they did their research.
They did. So yeah, that's pretty much the gist of their conversation.
Wow, that was a lot.
It was, but I think it really highlights the complexity of this situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the many different perspectives that are out there. So it's not easy to make sense of it all.
No, it's not.
But I think it's important to try and to consider all the different viewpoints.
For sure.
So for you, the listener, what do you think is the most important factor in all of this? What do you think will ultimately determine the outcome of this conflict? It's a question worth pondering. And we encourage you to continue exploring this issue and learning more about it, because it's one of the most important issues of our time. and it's going to have a major impact on the world. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.